Chaos is coming. A new sovereign debt crisis looms. Ukraine will deteriorate dangerously, and central banks have failed. Look at the $1.5 trillion assets that Credit Suisse is in danger of losing, going bankrupt, just like Lehman's. You'll see that in the previous video to this. And now this has to do with the Greek system, but we can expect this happening throughout Europe. The Greek stock market will be at 700 to 680 units, and then we'll see if we have seen the lowest of the year or if there will be much lower lows. Chaos is coming and it will last for months. The situation is much worse than it appears. Factor that can cause chaos in Ukraine. The advance of the Ukrainians in the fall of Lehman, a small but strategically important city, will escalate Russia's reaction, and to protect the new territories of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions that will need to use 300,000 Russian soldiers that will be sent there to east and southern Ukraine. If this plan also fails, or something goes wrong militarily for Russia, the use of tactical nuclear weapons will be the only way forward for them. Now, the situation is escalating rather than de-escalating. After occupying important territories, Russia has taken a defensive stance, but in practice, it's under pressure both in Donetsk and Lugansk and Kherson. Although the defense strategy of the Russian forces is overwhelming, where the main forces of the Russians have been defended, the Ukrainians have suffered annihilation and lost thousands of soldiers. Ukraine is a major factor that can wreak havoc on economies and markets worldwide. It should be noted that all indications covered that the sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and 2 was caused by Russian and British forces, who had every reason to decimate the Russian-built and Russian-operated energy tool, a factor that can cause chaos in government bonds. Now, did that happen? Was it caused by Russians? Now, the bond markets are approaching the point where many countries will be locked out of the markets and unable to borrow. A debt crisis is looming. The failure of governments that build up enormous debt and staggering deficits because they had rested on central banks that had inflated their balance sheets for 10 years with quantitative easing by creating money and liquidity out of thin air has caused a global distortion of epic proportions. A sovereign debt crisis looms. Together with the debt crisis, the nationalization of energy companies, and perhaps soon the risk of a major bank bankruptcy will increase. Credit Suisse is already at risk, and worst of all, it has a large exposure to Nord Stream, which has financed it, and which it has financed, and there are obviously many questions being raised about the liquidity and capital of Switzerland's big investment bank. And the middle class, as always, is at risk. When quantitative easing started 10 years ago, no one saw the toxin. Quantitative easing turned out to be an adenocarcinoma in the body of societies and economies. Everyone believed the false fictitious wealth. The central banks and the European Central Bank ECB of Draghi, who managed it, and finally with Lagarde, flooded a system with air of liquidity without diffusing the wealth in the societies. The money was reaped by the few, those who were strong enough even before the cumulative supply of liquidity. The Fed in the US flooded the Wall Street with liquidity, and the companies took the liquidity and proceeded to repurchase their own shares, spending $850 to $950 billion annually to prop up stocks. No productive investment, no public investment. Governments have rested on zero-cost Fed and ECB money, run up debt and budget deficits. The root of inflation is quantitative easing. It took root as a toxin and poisoned the economic fabric. It was only a matter of time. Quantitative easing by central banks is the perennial crime against economies. When fictitious liquidity of 5.5 trillion was created in the global system of dollars, It does not correspond to the production of goods and services. No one spoke. When negative yield bonds, mind you, to own a bond you have to lose capital, hit $19.8 trillion, no one spoke. When bankrupt countries like Greece arrived to borrow at 0.54% interest rates on 10-year bonds, no one spoke. When government debt increased 15% to 18% over a period of 2.5 years, in the midst of a recession, a pandemic, an energy crisis, no one spoke. But someone spoke, and that is inflation, which is a monetary phenomenon related to the money supply. Inflation is not here to go, it's here to stay for many years. The energy crisis and Putin with the invasion of Russia just made it worse. Inflation has a lot to do with energy costs, and the big victim is the middle class. The destruction of the middle class as a social economic reality is a mechanism for absorbing shocks in the foundations of a society. The poor can have a realistic goal to become middle class. The existing middle bourgeois may have to realistically aim to maintain financial well-being. The middle class is the health of society and an economy. It is the main driving force. The elites of the rich may determine the fate of the people, but the middle class is a dynamic part of the society. It determines the political, social, and economic developments. Inflation and the energy crisis have especially hit the middle class in Europe, which has suffered severe damage. See Germany. The middle class as a shock absorber mechanism has lost its power. The chaos in the stock markets will be of epic proportions. Some argue that the central banks, the Federal Reserve of the United States, the European Central Bank of Europe, will save the stock markets, but it is too late. Central banks have bigger things to save, so stock markets will be left to their own devices. This is by Banking News Greece. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.